Chapter 4. Massacre. Making use of the gently rolling hills of red earth, the two armies took up their positions and scowled at each other. The kingdom's army, surprisingly large with 245,000 men, had a right wing of 70,000, a left wing of 70,000, and 105,000 in the center. These were spread resourcefully in camps across 3 hills. The camps were the type made not with fences, but with the sheer violence of numbers. The first 5 rows of soldiers held spears nearly 20 feet long that required 2 hands. It was with those thickets of pikes that the positions were constructed. It was a measure against the main attacking force of the Empire, their heavy cavalry, and also acted in place of chevaux de frise. The reason they didn't have chevaux de frise was simply because it would have taken a ridiculous amount of wood to protect such a huge army. Putting their men to work with the spears was more efficient. That said, though this formidable formation was strong, it still had many weak points. The men were crowded together, and due to the heavy weapons, they had their hands full preventing their opponent's charge. For that reason, they lacked the ability to cope with any quick actions, and if the Empire launched arrows or spells, they would suffer serious casualties. But these peasant soldiers weren't being asked to do any more than that. Their only task was to stop their enemy's first attack. Meanwhile, the Empire's army had 60,000 men. Compared to the kingdom's forces, they were overwhelmingly few. But the Imperial Knights didn't look at all like they expected defeat with their calmly superior faces. They didn't think they would lose. They were confident because they knew how much stronger they were individually. Still, the gap in numbers should have been a major concern. If they could fight perpetually without getting tired, maybe not, but that was impossible for humans. If they got worn out, their opponents would eventually catch up, despite the gap in their abilities. The kingdom had one other big advantage: the gap in the worth of the people. Most of the soldiers making up the kingdom's army were farmers. In contrast, the Empire's knights were professional warriors. If a farmer who was handed a weapon and a knight who required time and effort to train were both killed, the Empire's loss was greater. For that reason, the Empire wouldn't undertake unreasonable operations or the sort that were likely to get knights killed. This flat battlefield, then, where all they could do was clash head-on, would work in the kingdom's favor. That was why previous wars between the kingdom and the Empire had always ended as minor scuffles. The Empire normally achieved its goal just by having the kingdom drag its farmers out onto the battlefield. They weren't about to do anything that would deplete their precious human assets, which the kingdom understood quite well. This sort of essentially rigged fight was what the wars between the kingdom and the Empire had been. Most of the kingdom nobles believed that even if the caster Ainz Ooal Gown joined in, this war would still end as a casual dust-up. The Empire's knights weren't only its military force but also its police organization. They were the power that maintained the peace. Pointless losses were liable to shake the foundations of the country. The kingdom waited for the Empire's forces to make their move. In a normal year, the Imperial army would pass in front of the kingdom's army and then withdraw. Then the kingdom's army would let out a triumphant shout. That was how it usually went. But the Imperial forces weren't moving. They had left their fortress-like barracks and taken up a position opposite the kingdom's forces, but they hadn't moved a muscle since then. It was almost as if they were waiting for the kingdom to make a move, or perhaps there was something else they were waiting for. They're not moving, what could it mean? Slightly behind the 105,000 men jostling in the central group was the king's position. It was the safest position, located on top of a somewhat tall hill. Marquis Raven, standing next to Gazef, was the one who had spoken as he looked out at the unmoving Imperial Knights. If the Empire didn't move, the kingdom couldn't move either. As conveyed by the thickets of spears, the kingdom knew that attacking would be the height of folly. A long time ago, some nobles had taken the initiative to attack, but they were killed instantaneously, and the kingdom ended up suffering substantial losses. Ever since then, the kingdom's tactics for facing the empire were to set up their spear walls and wait. If their opponents would fall back on their own, there was no sense in leaping into danger. Well, it seems like they're waiting for us to move. The final proposals have already been given, and the war has already started. Captain, Sir Gazef, do you have any idea what the Empire might be waiting for? 30 minutes ago, messengers had negotiated between the two armies, glaring at each other. Well, they called them negotiations, but it was more like a game of exchanging unfeasible conditions. Basically, they said, look how merciful we're being, pretending to avoid the war to the last even though their offers were self-serving. Naturally, they failed to reach an understanding, and it always came down to war. In a normal year, the Empire would have already been on the move. But this year, they weren't. They simply stood at attention. Any idea? I mean, do you? No. I don't know much about military matters, so I've always left it up to my men. I know all too well how knowledgeable you are, your lordship, so that sounds an awful lot like a lie, but, a lie, you certainly don't mince words, Sir Gazef. Have I offended you? If so, I'm sorry. No, that's fine. I much prefer this attitude to how you were before. Gazef picked up on the jab and frowned. Please just accept what I said. It's the truth that I don't have much skill in moving troops. And I happen to have a man under me who excels in just that. I'm not lying. I leave it up to him. Could it be one of the former adventurers who are now famous for their performance during the demon disturbance? No, they're over there. A group of 5 people was standing in the corner Marquis Raven pointed at. They had all entered middle age and were probably past their prime, but as they were also former orichalcum-plate adventurers, even Gazef had the feeling that one couldn't be too careful around them. They're my bodyguards. If you have such strong people protecting you, you'll be sure to make it back to the capital in one piece, assuming we don't have to face that great caster. But wait, so who is your strategist? You don't know him. He's a commoner from my domain. I heard about him because he fought off a horde of goblins attacking his village with only half as many villagers. After that, I started putting him in command, and the surprising thing is, he hasn't lost yet. He's that good. I've given him a high rank in my staff. If he can earn such praise from you, Marquis Raven, then, I'd like to meet him. I'd like to give him command of the entire kingdom's army. If you put him in command, and the kingdom's army operated as one, I'm sure he would do battle in ways that would make neighboring countries say, you mustn't take the Riestai's kingdom's army lightly. Gazef and Marquis Raven looked at each other, heaved tired sighs, and smiled. The nobles would never allow a commoner to command the army. At present, it's a pipe dream. Yeah, it's impossible while we have these factions. The Imperial Army had proper organization with a general in charge of each army and then division commanders and battalion commanders. But in the kingdom, each noble brought his own soldiers, so even with the king as the overall commander, each unit acted according to their own ideas and faction alignment. To be blunt, the army had no unity whatsoever. Even Gazef was charged with leading the Royal Select only as their captain. It wasn't as if he could give orders to the nobles. Certainly, there was the possibility of getting his ideas through his orders from the king, but many of the nobles looked down on Gazef due to his common background and would find it disagreeable, so it could cause trouble for him in the future. The king knew that, so when he gave orders, he didn't do it through Gazef. The 2 men sighed heavily at the state of their country. Then they looked at each other and smiled. This discussion was one to have somewhere else, not on the battlefield where swords were about to clash. If we survive this, we'll still be on the battlefield, I guess. I hear that's how it is for nobles. When this is over, I'm going to tell the king to please make you a noble. It irritated me that you were the king's sword, yet you never tried to engage with noble society. The Marquis said it in a joking way, but Gazef could see from the glint in his eyes that he actually was angry. He was glad that someone so skilled at concealing his emotions would show them to him, but it wasn't as nice when it was a negative emotion. Gazef changed the subject. Well, leaving that for now, could we call over your strategist? I'd like to talk to him, although I guess it's tricky to have him come here at the moment. Yes, he's heading up my position. We don't know when the Empire will make its move, so I want to keep him where he is. Marquis Raven may have been cooperating with the kingdom, but his top priority was still his own domain. Refusing was only natural. Even though it's the same old pattern, I just don't like this tense atmosphere. Gazef sighed. I'm not hoping for a serious charge from the Empire, but if they're going to attack, it'd be better for my mental health if they would just launch it already. He sensed the unsteadiness in the kingdom's army and tried to locate the source. One potential strategy the Empire could take is to wait for the kingdom to get antsy and act. It would be hard to move all these men together. But for that reason, any force's slightest movement will look like a large ripple from the edge. Even if we're packed together and there are too many of us to go on the attack, they could easily rip to pieces any prey that is out of line. They're like a beast on the hunt. Marquis Raven followed Gazef's nervous gaze, but when he saw the soldiers in the left wing rushing around, he seemed to grasp something. It looks to me like they're trying to move soldiers from the back up to the front line. If they're only changing formation, then we don't need to worry, but that's Marquis Bolarope's flag. It seems like the general of the left wing means to move up to the front line himself. The kingdom had nobles' faction members on either wing and king's faction members concentrated in the center. The commander of the center group was King Ramposa III, and the commander of the left wing was Marquis Bolarope. It's highly unusual for the general to change the formation, so he's up front. You know, Sir Gazef, that the Marquis brought his elite men. This war will get the attention of many nobles, so if his forces can put up an admirable fight against the individually stronger Imperial Knights, he'll be recognized as the noble with the strongest unit in the kingdom. Marquis Raven flashed a provocative look at Gazef as if to say, won't it bother you if his unit is considered stronger than your royal select? But that wasn't about to ruffle Gazef. The royal select is guarding His Majesty. Even if the Empire charges, I have no intention of moving them without His Majesty's orders. Their only job is to make sure the king gets back to the capital safely. He patted his sword. Although there's the possibility that I go out on my own to kill the enemy's momentum. The kingdom has 4 treasures, and that's Razor Edge? I see, the Marquis looked at Gazef from top to bottom. The gauntlets of vitality made it so the wearer never got fatigued, the amulet of immortality constantly healed the wearer, guardian armor, made from the hardest metal in existence, adamantite, was said to be able to save the wearer from a fatal critical hit. And Razor Edge was a magic sword enchanted in the pursuit of sharpness that cut armor like butter. With all of them equipped, you yourself are the kingdom's greatest treasure. I heard that the kingdom originally had 5 treasures, but have they always been together right here? Receiving such an overblown compliment, being compared to a treasure, Gazef knew it was flattery but couldn't stop himself from blushing. Cut it out, Marquis Raven. His Majesty is the truly amazing one. Knowing full well what it would mean to lend all these to a commoner, he still entrusted them to me. You do have a point. Honestly, I thought it was foolish to entrust them to a commoner. I thought it would only mean more people leaving the king's faction. But now that we're here together on the battlefield, it seems like a great idea, as self-centered as that is. I hope I can live up to your expectations. Gazef looked out at the ranks of Imperial Knights. With the exception of Triad caster Flutter Paradine, he didn't feel like they had any particularly strong opponents. He was confident that he could beat their strongest 4 knights. He even had a faint hope that, with all the treasures equipped, he could take Flutter. But he didn't think he could beat Ainz Ooal Gown. He just couldn't see it happening. No matter how positively he tried to visualize things, no matter how optimistic he was, he saw himself getting killed with a single mysterious spell. What's wrong? Nothing. He was known as the kingdom's strongest warrior. If he showed any weakness, it would have an adverse effect on the soldiers' morale. I mean, I was just feeling sorry for Prince Barbaro. Sorry for him. Could it be that? I see. So you. I see. What are you trying to say? No, it just seems like you think that the king sent the prince to Karn to stop him from achieving anything here. Was there some other reason? Marquis Raven winced. Yes, there certainly was. His Majesty really trusts you, you know. Gazef had no idea what that was supposed to mean, and it showed on his doubtful face, so the Marquis explained. Naturally, if the king's most trusted captain is extremely wary of Ainz Ooal Gown, so is he. Rather than putting his son on a battlefield where no one knows what will happen, he sent him somewhere safe, even though there isn't as much to achieve there. The old me would have been offended that he sent his child somewhere safe when so many parents were sending their children to the battlefield. Then he smiled with the face of a father. But now I understand. I would probably do the same for my son. Yeah, Marquis Raven, you're a father through and through. Marquis Raven smiled. Gazef knew it was rude, but he couldn't help but think it was out of character for his expression to be so warm, happy, and proud. I sure am. I promised I'd play with him a bunch after this war is over. I'm an utterly normal father. But we've gotten off topic. Anyhow, that's how it is, but I'm sure Prince Barbaro doesn't understand his father's feelings. That's a bit sad, a parent's feelings not getting through to his child. Gazef wasn't sure how to respond. He didn't have kids, so he couldn't really relate. Right. Do you think there could be a detachment going to raid Irantal? They might stop at nothing to bring it down, even if they were heavily criticized. I've been changing the subject every time I don't know what to say, thought Gazef, but the Marquis went along with it. It won't be so easy to take down Irantal with its 3 layers of walls. It would probably be tough even if they mobilized their 2 remaining corps. My strategist doubts they would try an operation like that. But what about using flying mounts? Or what if they had another secret army? It would be impossible. Ultimately, it's a difficult proposition to conquer a city with small numbers. Without more people, they wouldn't be able to take it. Sir Gazef, there's one critical requirement for capturing Irantal. Do you know what it is? Gazef honestly shook his head. You need to claim a great victory in a head-on fight with the kingdom. If it was a narrow victory, it would be difficult to rule after the fact. There is no way the citizens would take kindly to invaders, so a resistance movement would spring up. Even if the Empire managed to take Irantal with a detachment, if our soldiers were unharmed, they would move immediately to retake it. That's why the Empire is aiming for a crushing victory. That way the citizens will be too scared to resist and there won't be enough army left to fight. Essentially, the Empire had to win this battle. And it had to be such an overwhelming victory that it would make neighboring countries, and especially the kingdom, think twice about trying to retake the territory. Suddenly, Gazef felt like he had all the pieces of the puzzle. He just couldn't discern what he was supposed to be seeing. He was tormented by a vague sense of foreboding. What's wrong, Sir Gazef? He thought if he told Marquis Raven about all the mixed-up puzzle pieces in his head, he would use his superior intellect to put them together for him, but the Marquis suddenly turned to face the Empire's position. Sir Gazef, it seems they're finally making a move. The Imperial army was parting as if to create a path. Just as Gazef figured they must have been splitting to counter the kingdom's left and right wings, a flag he didn't recognize was raised in the center. It was a flag with a crest that Gazef had absolutely no knowledge of, from neither the kingdom nor the Empire. A group of figures bearing it proceeded forward. All eyes were on that group. Then Gazef had a sense of dread. Next to him, surely witnessing the same events, Marquis Raven swallowed hard. Realizing he wasn't the only one feeling it, Gazef sensed a bitter taste spread across the back of his tongue, and his heart began to pound. They were a strange force. It was about 500 mounted soldiers, hardly anything compared to the 2 armies facing each other. But there was something abnormal about them. Even at this distance, their ghastly presence seemed to pummel him. Gazef's memories of Karn came vividly back to him. The monster knights Ainz said he had created. There were about 200 warriors with the same spiked armor and giant shields. The rest were also grotesque soldiers, but they wore leather armor, and he saw they carried weapons like axes, spears, and crossbows. If the ones in front were knights, then the ones in the back were warriors, he supposed. Either way, they weren't human. They were genuine monsters. And they were riding magical beasts. They could properly be described as bone monsters, wrapped in a wavering fog rather than flesh. Yellow like pus and a brilliant green occasionally flashed within the haze. Gazef's whole body erupted in goosebumps. This is bad. This is really bad. His impression wasn't terribly articulate, but he couldn't come up with any words more appropriate. So the Empire has incorporated monsters into its army? This is quite a surprise. Really gives you goosebumps. No. No, Marquis Raven, that's not it. That's not why you have goosebumps, the Marquis asked, curiously. It's the threat of death. It stimulates our human survival instinct. Marquis Raven was surprised, but Gazef turned away from him to look at the Imperial army. Their horses are cowering. Even trained warhorses are frightened into paralysis. What could that possibly be? Does the Empire have a secret unit? No, how could that be? Those aren't monsters that humans could tame and control. He wasn't sure what kind of monsters they were, but his intuition as a warrior made him confident of that. That has to be Ainz Ooal Gown's cavalry. That's the army of the caster you're afraid of? Marquis Raven. I want you to gather your former adventurers on the double. What is the optimal course of action? I want to ask people who have fought tons of monsters and lived. He was probably going to say he understood. But before he could, they moved to protect their master. Of course they did. They probably had a better idea of how powerful their opponents were than even Gazef. Marquis Raven. The former orichalcum plates raced over on their horses. Did you see that? Do you feel it? At the head of the group was their leader, a holy knight of the fire god, Boris Axelson. His voice contained fear he couldn't hide. Marquis Raven was speechless. Gazef knew exactly how he felt. A former orichalcum plate adventurer, in this position protected by a huge army, was so frightened his voice was trembling. Gazef determined it was no longer any time to be fretting about manners and asked, "Tell me, what is that?" No need for introductions. I just want you to tell me what you know. Boris clutched the sigil hanging around his neck as if it would protect him. I'm not sure, but the monsters they're riding seem to be the soul eaters of legend. They're a type of greedy undead that devours the souls of the living. Folklore says they appeared in a city in the center of the continent, in the country of the beast men. And what was the damage? Boris's reply was horribly quiet. 100,000, Gazef gasped. Supposedly, 3 soul eaters showed up, and the city was destroyed. 95% of the population, over 100,000 people, died, and legend has it that it was renamed the Silent City, then abandoned. A heavy silence fell. And there are 500 of them here? No one had the strength to answer Marquis Raven's question. Gazef finally managed to squeeze out some words. As I said earlier, I don't think the Empire could control monsters like that on its own, even with their great caster flutter paradigm. So, he didn't have to finish for Marquis Raven to understand. So this is the power of Ainz Ooal Gown? Then what are the things riding those monsters? The adventurers looked at one another. We don't know. But they're just as dangerous. No, my apologies. This probably requires a proper explanation, not a vague word like dangerous, but nothing better comes to mind. What should we do, Sir Gazef? Gazef responded to Marquis Raven's unnerved question concisely. Withdraw. He understood well enough that the enemy had prepared a shocking army. So what else could they do but run away? I'll suggest it to the kin. He didn't get to finish what he was saying, because a masked caster took up position at the head of the army. To his right was a small figure in a hooded robe. To his left was one of the Empire's 4. Even at that distance, Gazef knew who it was at a glance. Sir Gown, that's the caster Ainz Ooal Gown? He summoned the Soul Eaters? That guy? Marquis Raven, what? The veteran hero gulped and gasped in a murmur, what are we going up against? Ainz waved an arm. In response, a gigantic dome-shaped magic circle, it must have been at least 30 feet across, suddenly appeared with Ainz at its center. The two standing to either side of him were also inside it, but nothing seemed to happen to them as a result. It must not have been something that could hurt his allies. Even the ones who knew they were facing an emergency couldn't help but watch the fantastic spectacle. The magic circle glowed pale blue, and patterns like translucent letters or symbols appeared on it. These letters changed at a dizzying rate, the same pattern didn't linger for even an instant. A gasp of surprise went up from the kingdom. It was like the ooze or as one might emit while seeing a splendid show, they contained no tension. But those with sharp intuitions began looking around in confusion. I'm going back to my army. We can't even consider a clash anymore. Ainz Ooal Gown's power is on another level, and trying to do battle with him was a mistake. From now on, we should focus on figuring out how to make it back to Irantal while keeping losses to a minimum. Sir Gazef, protect His Majesty and withdraw at once. Marquis Raven had been so calm until just moments ago, but no longer. Right. I'm not sure how much I can do, but I will go guard the king. And we shouldn't retreat in ranks, but, of course not. This will be a withdrawal at a furious pace, it's a rout. Very well, Marquis Raven. I hope you'll be safe. And you, Sir Gazef. The kingdom's greatest intellect and warrior leaped into motion. Except. It was far too late. Guess there aren't any, Ainz determined as he expanded the magic circle. There were no players in the kingdom's army. Super-tier spells from the game Yggdrasil were immensely powerful. For that reason, in a large-scale battle, neutralizing anyone trying to cast one first was the basics of combat. Using teleport to close in and stab, magic carpet bombing, long-range sniping, there were countless methods of attack. Yet no one came at Ainz. Their absence was proof that there were no other Yggdrasil players present. Without anyone knowing, Ainz's mouth beneath his mask twisted into a smile, although of course, it was impossible for him to smile as a skeleton. The wry grin of his subtle delight spoke volumes about his mood. I guess I don't need to be bait anymore. He was glad he didn't encounter any Yggdrasil players. Ainz could not be called the strongest among Yggdrasil players. There was always someone stronger. Against a player stronger than him, he probably didn't stand much of a chance. Ainz's power during the era of the game had stemmed from his knowledge. In PvP, he had a high win ratio, but it could be considered a streak only if the first encounters were ignored. Ainz was actually ingenious when it came to utilizing information he accumulated. Conversely, against opponents he faced for the first time, his loss ratio was extremely high. He knew himself to some degree, so he was thankful he hadn't encountered a new, strong enemy. On the other hand, it was a bit of a disappointment. It didn't seem like they would find any leads about the being who possessed the world item and had brainwashed Shaltir. There was still some stubborn hatred in Ainz's mind. Waves of powerful emotions were suppressed, but the ripples of weaker emotions persisted. Ainz opened his hands, and inside was a small hourglass. He could have used a cash store item to cast the super-tier spell immediately. The reason he hadn't was that he was acting as bait for Yggdrasil players. But if there weren't any, he no longer had any reason to space out during the long casting time. It was really uncool to stand around in the middle of a magic circle. During the fight with Shaltir, he had been too stressed out. During the fight with the lizard men, he didn't use attack magic. So, I'm really looking forward to this. It's going to be so fun. What kind of effect would his super tier spell have on the kingdom's army? In Yggdrasil, this one wasn't so powerful, but what would it do in this world? Suddenly, Ainz furrowed his non-existent brow. He was ever so slightly horrified by his complete lack of pity or any other emotion for the numerous humans who would die. He truly felt nothing, not even the guilt that came from stomping on an ant. What he did feel was a desire to see the outcomes of his actions. That, and the benefits that he and the great tomb of Massacre would reap. Ainz focused energy into his hands. The sand falling out of the broken hourglass flowed toward the magic circle, surrounding him in a motion that was different from the wind's. And the super tier spell was cast instantly. Ainz Ooal. A dark breath blew past the left wing of the kingdom's army, which had finally finished reorganizing its formation. No, there was no actual wind. None of the grasses on the plain nor the hairs on the kingdom's soldiers' heads rustled. But all 70,000 men of the kingdom army's left wing were robbed of their lives in an instant. What had just happened? Not a single person understood right away. All the living things that made up the kingdom's army's left wing, not just the humans, but the horses, too, fell to the ground like marionettes whose strings had been cut. The first to realize what had happened was the Imperial army facing them. What the Imperials had seen was so unbelievable that there was a lag between then and when their brains arrived at a conclusion. At that point, the commotion became an unusually large wave that engulfed the entire army. Certainly, they had known that when Ainz Ooal Gown projected the magic circle, he was probably about to unleash some sort of spell. But who could have predicted this? Who knew he would cast something so horrifying? Who would have thought he would use a spell that would slaughter 70,000 men, more than all the Imperial troops that had been deployed to this battlefield combined, in an instant? Doubting their eyes, the Imperial knights all prayed to whatever they believed in. That the kingdom's soldiers weren't dead. That such a horrible spell didn't exist in this world. Of course, with the truth right in front of them, no one was getting up. They knew that was nothing more than wishful thinking. But their emotions wouldn't accept it. They didn't want to acknowledge the truth as the truth. Even Nimble, one of the four, those pillars of Imperial strength, was staring at the now deserted kingdom left-wing position with his teeth chattering in fear. The reality that no one was getting up was so terrifying. No, a description that simple couldn't cover it. Ainz Ooal Gown, this caster, was a monster who could tear down human nations as if they were sandcastles. That reality hit Nimble stronger than any words. The commotion enveloping the Imperial army ebbed like a tide and vanished. Eventually, everyone kept silent, no one daring to speak. Once everything was still in the Imperial army position, a bizarre noise echoed. It was so many noises overlapping that it was actually quite a racket. It was the sound of every single knight's teeth clacking together. Fear, because they all knew that their beloved empire, where their families lived, was on the brink of destruction just like the kingdom. Making an enemy of Ainz Ooal Gown would mean that spell would be shot at them. Suddenly, Nimble wondered how the inhuman caster felt after such a massive magical slaughter. Without turning his head, he stole a look out of the corner of his eye at the monster standing next to him, and the monster was unfazed. That can't be. That can't be. This. How can he be so calm? He just robbed 70,000 people of their lives. I get that this is a battlefield, a place for such atrocities to occur. It's only natural to slay your weak opponents. But isn't it natural to feel something after killing that many people? It would have been perfectly natural to feel guilt or regret. Joy or delight, he would have been able to understand in the context of an atypical mind. But is feeling nothing a defensive instinct to protect his psyche? No. This monster is used to seeing scenes like this. He doesn't even feel the pity or dark glee of a human stomping a bunch of ants. What is this? It's awful. Why is a guy like this in the human world? What? It was like having cold steel driven through him. After emitting such a stupid noise in response to the question, Nimble tried to gloss over it. Nothing. That was a wonderful spell. He wanted to pat himself on the back for getting some words out. And surely, he deserved the highest praise for even managing to compliment Ainz. The response to Nimble's frantic compliment was a chuckle. "Did I say something to displease you?" No, nothing like that. You said, that was a wonderful spell, right?" "Yes." Was that the part he was scoffing about? Sweat dripped down Nimble's forehead. Having just witnessed how horrible it was to offend this person, he didn't want to upset him in the slightest. "You don't have to be so guarded. It's just, my spell hasn't finished yet. The best part is yet to come. Our offering to the Mother Goddess Shub-Niggurath will come back to us bearing the return gift of her young. The young are just adorable. Yes. Just like returning ripe fruit to the earth." Once again, it was the Imperial Knights who noticed it first. It was utterly natural that the knights watching from the distance in the safest position would be the first to notice. It was precisely because they felt safe that they were able to see it even with their narrow field of vision through the slits in their helmets. After the whirlpool of death robbed the kingdom's soldiers of their lives, a weird pitch-black sphere appeared out of the heavens as if it were going to soil the world. So who was the first kingdom soldier to notice it? This is mere conjecture, but since the right-wing soldiers had their view obstructed, it was probably them. Even if they realized something unusual was going on, not knowing what, they would have looked around and spotted it. Compelled to follow their neighbor's gaze, the next soldier and the next soldier after that noticed. Soon, all the people who had been about to wage war on the Katsa plain were just staring silently at the black sphere floating in the sky. The sphere, like a hole in the sky, seemed almost like it was covered in a spiderweb, in that anyone who saw it found themselves unable to look away. The black orb grew gradually larger. They couldn't think anything constructive like, "Let's run" or "Let's fight." They could only stare mutely, as if they had dementia. Before long, the adequately ripened fruit fell. In what seemed like the obvious outcome, the sphere popped when it touched the ground. Like a water balloon bursting against the ground, like a ripe fruit rupturing. The contents of the sphere radiated out from the point of impact. It was like coal tar, a sticky liquid spreading its pitch blackness everywhere, reflecting no light at all. It began to conceal the dead kingdom soldiers. Perhaps operating under some abnormal instinct, no one thought this was the end. And more than that, they had the feeling it was only the beginning. Yes, the beginning of despair. From the earth coated in the black liquid grew a single tree. No, it wasn't anything so cute as a tree. What once was one began to multiply. 2, 3, 5, 10. Swaying where there was no wind, what had grown there were tentacles. All of a sudden, they heard something adorable, like a goat's bleating. And it wasn't just one. It was like a herd of goats had appeared out of nowhere. As if drawn by the voices, the coal tar wriggled and then sprayed upward to reveal something. It was too strange, too different. It must have been over 30 feet tall. Counting the tentacles, it was hard to say. Shape-wise, it resembled a turnip. Instead of leaves, it had several writhing black tentacles, and the root part was a bumpy lump of flesh. From below that grew 5 goat-like black legs with hooves. There were splits in the root part, the bumpy lump of flesh, that peeled back in flaps. The adorable goat bleating issued from those fissures. The splits were mouth-drooling a viscous black liquid. There were 5 of these. They had revealed their horrifying selves completely to all the humans on the Katsa plain. The dark young. They were monsters that emerged in proportion to the number of sacrifices collected by the super-tier spell IA Shub-Niggurath. They didn't have any powerful skills, but their stamina was a cut above normal. And their level was over 90. In other words, it was a storm of atrocities. There were no sounds besides the adorable, sickeningly cute, bleating. It was just that. Unable to believe what they were seeing, unable to accept it, no one tried to talk. Over 300,000 people were gathered, although only 235,000 remained alive, and not a single one of them could make so much as a peep. It was before this horrific spectacle that Ainz laughed. Wonderful. That's a record. I'm sure no matter where or when you look, no one has ever summoned 5 at once before. This is truly awesome. I've got to give thanks to all those who died for me. Normally, summoning 1 dark young was great, and the rare feat of summoning 2 was practically impossible. But this time he got 5. Just like how any gamer would enjoy setting a new record, Ainz was genuinely happy. He didn't care at all about the tens of thousands who had just perished. But I think there should actually be more of them. Maybe 5 is the cap? But then that means I got the most possible, which is amazing. Congratulations. Brilliant as usual, Lord Ainz. Ainz smiled beneath his mask in response to Mare's praise. Thanks, Mare. Next, when Ainz looked at Nimble, the knight promptly celebrated him with a crying smile on his face. See, congratulations. Thanks, Ainz replied in good spirits. It tickled him that Nimble openly expressed how touched he was. Ainz remembered the first time he had seen Ainz back in his Yggdrasil player days, and how equally moving an experience it had been for him. Over-the-top magic, overwhelming magic, it has the power to tug so many people's heartstrings. No wonder, then, that this was such a popular spell in Yggdrasil. Albedo and Demiurge were both thrilled to hear I would be casting it. A clattering noise began to echo throughout the Imperial Army's position. It was plates of armor rubbing on each other. The soldiers were quivering. Who could laugh at something like this? There wasn't a single one of them who didn't get goosebumps from the King of Darkness's cheerful voice after he had just cast such a dreadful summoning spell. All the knights had one thing on their minds. May the power of Ainz Ooal Gown never descend upon me. It resembled a prayer to a god. As the soldier's wishes gathered on his back, Ainz shifted into the next phase. His spell had already achieved a satisfying effect, but he thought it would be worth it to double down on his attack, just in case. His objective this time was to advertise the power of Ainz Ooal Gown to nearby countries via super-tier magic. There was no doubt he had done just that. But it would be a waste to simply erase his creations. Yes, a waste. Ainz sneered. If he had had a tongue, he probably would have licked his lips. In Yggdrasil, this never would have been possible, the joy of summoning 5 dark young at once. Let's see what happens. Begin a follow-up attack, my precious young. Following the order from their summoner, the dark young slowly began to move. They worked their 5 legs briskly, with strange motions. Rather than elegant, it was incredibly earnest, which might have had something heartwarming about it. At least for someone they weren't bearing down on. Nimbly moving their large bodies, the 5-legged dark young began to run and charged at the kingdom's army. There are 3 people, no, 4, whom you mustn't kill. Do not harm them. Recalling the 3 people Demiurge had pled for, Ainz gave a mental, not that he had a brain, order to the dark young. This is a dream, right? One of the kingdom's soldiers murmured at the grotesque monsters in the distance. But there was no answer. How could there have been? Everyone was transfixed by the scene unfolding before their eyes. They didn't have the wherewithal to respond. It was like their souls had been spirited away. Hey, tell me it's a dream. I'm dreaming, right? Yeah. It's a fantastically awful dream. The second time he asked, someone finally replied. There was something escapist in his tone of voice. This can't be happening. I can't believe it. Feelings like that had infested the troops. The grotesque beings were growing steadily larger, closer, and the soldiers didn't want to face reality. If it were simply a couple of monsters, they probably could have mustered the courage to swing their weapons. But when those monsters appeared after a 70,000-man block of their army had been wiped out instantaneously, they couldn't be written off as a couple of monsters. It was like facing a gigantic tornado heading straight for them. No one had the courage to stand and fight. The strange, immense beings skillfully worked their stumpy legs, charging with quite some speed. Spears up. A voice rang out. A noble was screaming in a weird octave. His eyes were bloodshot, and he had foam at the corners of his mouth. "Get your spears up. Ivy, you wanna survive, raise those spears up." He was so beside himself with fear that it was hard to understand what he was saying, but it was still possible to discern, "Get your spears up." And that was the most appropriate order. The soldiers promptly held up their weapons to form the thickets of blades. By virtue of the butt end of the spears being fixed to the ground, the speed of any opponent who came charging would be turned into a weapon, and their bodies would be eviscerated. It was a formation that would give even the Empire's knights trouble, but a rational corner of the soldiers' minds wondered what meaning the flimsy spears in their hands could possibly have. But they also knew that this formation was their only chance. It would be next to impossible to run away from these monsters that grew larger and larger as they approached with uncanny speed. If they ran, they would surely be trampled from behind by those huge hooves. "Stay away from me," was the soldiers' fervent wish as they waited while the monsters charged. With sickening quickness, the once tiny-seeming horrors grew larger and larger, closer and closer. As they grew larger, and the ground began to shake, the soldiers' hearts beat faster. Eventually, when their hearts were pounding so hard they thought they might burst, the hulking monsters charged right up to them. The scene resembled a dump truck slamming into a nest of mice. On the kingdom's side, countless spears were held at the ready in trembling hands. But what significance did that hold for the dark young who had such massive, robust bodies? The spears snapped easier than toothpicks, unable to do so much as scratch them. The immense, dark young dove in among the kingdom soldiers. Innumerable broken spears flew through the air. Though they trampled the resistance that couldn't even really be considered resistance, the dark young were merciful, there was no pain. The overwhelming charge left no opportunity to feel pain. The soldiers holding spears didn't even have time to notice the moment the giant bodies smashed their spears. All they were aware of was a dark shadow that blocked out their vision. A scream went up, then another and another. Scraps of flesh flew. It wasn't one or two people. It wasn't even dozens, it was over 100. Flattened under huge feet, batted away, no, obliterated, by waving tentacles. Nobles, farmers, once they were transformed into scraps of flesh, none of that mattered. Whether they left behind families in their home villages, whether they left behind friends, even if they had no one waiting for them, once they turned into churned mush on the ground, none of that mattered. Death was the great equalizer. After the dark young trampled countless people under their giant feet, some might have thought it would end there, but they were wrong. The dark young ran. They didn't stop in the middle of the kingdom's army. "Make it stop. Save me." Every time those giant feet came down, another scream went up. The sound of humans being crushed together under the dark young stout legs, the sound of bodies being annihilated with the irregular waving of their tentacles, just for fun. They were sounds no one had ever heard in their life. Overrun. What other word could explain the scene so well? Some soldiers frantically thrust their spears. The tips certainly did hit the dark young, who were so large and had no intention of evading. But those spears didn't pierce their flesh at all. The monsters were like clods of thick rubber hide and steel muscle. Without even sneering at the futile resistance, the dark young only advanced. By the time the frantic soldiers realized that attacking would do nothing, the dark young had penetrated almost to the heart of the formation's center. "Withdraw! Withdraw now!" It was a distant shriek. In response to that cry, all the humans took off running. They scattered like baby spiders. But the dark young were far faster. The humans were trampled to death, and all that could be heard was the sound of countless lumps of flesh being created. 3 monsters, cutting through the central forces as if they were crossing an empty field, were approaching the right wing, kicking up flesh and blood along the way. They were nearly upon Marquis Raven's army. "Withdraw! Withdraw now," the Marquis screamed. They couldn't possibly face those things any longer. There was no need to throw away their lives without reason. When the soldiers heard the order, they threw down their weapons and fled in a panic. But there were too many people, leaving them unable to move freely. At first, Marquis Raven had been thinking of a more organized withdrawal. He had been concerned about being attacked from behind, but wasting time on that had been a huge mistake. So this is the caliber of the caster Ainz Ooal Gown? He had underestimated him. Well, he hadn't meant to. Based on what Gazef Stronov had said, he had imagined the most powerful being he could. But Ainz Ooal Gown was actually on a level where even that was an underestimation. This was too far beyond his expectations. Who in this world could have guessed that Ainz Ooal Gown possessed this much power? Who knew such power even existed? With an eye on the monsters as they closed the distance, gradually looming larger, he bawled out orders at the nearby soldiers. This battlefield is nothing but the site of a massacre now. Just run. Your lordship. A mounted knight removed his helmet as he shouted. The king. What will you do about the king? You idiot. There's no time to think of that. Your lordship. They're nearly upon us. At the shout, he shifted his gaze back. The right wing, collapsing as everyone scrambled to get away, was beginning to get overrun. It seemed like the monsters were making a beeline for him, but it was less like they were aiming for Marquis Raven and more as if it were just the happenstance outcome. And in reality, the other Dark Young were nowhere near the Marquis's position. Where is the king? Over there. When he followed the soldier's pointing finger, he saw there was already a Dark Young closing in on the king's flag. The Marquis hesitated. What would happen if he went to save him? But if they lost Ramposa III now, it could very well lead to the kingdom's ruin. But leave him to Sir Gazef. Marquis Raven trusted Gazef. He was the warrior the kingdom cherished. Of course, even he probably couldn't defeat the Dark Young, but surely he could pluck the king out of this hell and make it back alive. Marquis Raven. This is bad. Please hurry and make your escape. Marquis Raven's hesitation disappeared at the shout from his most trusted former Orichalcum-Plate adventurer. Your lordship. It was less of a shout and more of a shriek by that point. Marquis Raven roared back at him, I know. Let's get out of here. He didn't have the wherewithal to employ such a flowery word as withdraw with the monsters closing in. Please leave rounding up the army to me. You should leave this place as fast as you can. Flee to Irantal. The one shouting was a man with sleepy eyes. He didn't look like much, but there was no one else he would entrust the army to. Do it. If you need my name, use it. I'll take responsibility. The sound of the hooves was near. He was too scared to turn around, so he kicked his horse. But it didn't move. He kicked harder, but the horse still didn't move. It stood at attention with its ears down. At that moment, a group of horses tore through the confusion, kicking people aside as they went. The men on top clung desperately to the animals' bodies, seemingly unable to grab the reins. Ironically, the warhorses who were used to the battlefield were paralyzed with fear, but the untrained horses hurtled away in a panic. I never thought training my horse would come back to bite me. Horses were skittish by nature. It was through training that they became warhorses who stood unafraid on the battlefield. But that was why his horse was incapable of moving. It had suffering a mental shock, but its training taught it not to run. Excuse me. Lion's Heart. Wing god priest Joran Dixgord cast an anti-fear spell on the horse. Having regained composure, it snorted. Marquis Raven. We'll lead the way. Thanks. Marquis Raven raced off, under the protection of his former Orichalcum-Plate adventurers, to shouts of I pray you'll be safe. It was extremely difficult to ride a horse through a crowd that had lost all military discipline, resembling a rioting mob more than an army. But it was possible because his subordinates had been Orichalcum-Plate adventurers, with skills nearing the upper range of human potential. They wove expertly through the flow of people. That monstrous caster. He can't be allowed to stay in the human world. Rocking up and down in time to his horse's dash, the Marquis cursed Ainz. Shit. We've got to do something. We have to think of a way to defend the human world, our future. He mumbled in spite of himself out of fear. If he didn't say something, if he didn't distract himself, the danger would compel his intelligent brain to imagine all the nightmares closing in on him. When he got back, he would need to bring in Prince Zanuck and Princess Renner before coming up with countermeasures to face that extraordinarily powerful caster. At this rate, all of humanity would be conquered, if they were lucky. In the worst-case scenario, the human race might end up Ainz Ooal Gown's plaything for the rest of its existence. Someone nervously sucking their teeth was audible over the galloping horses. This is bad. Marquis Raven. Deer slowly to the right. We're being followed. They don't even seem to have eyes. How can it see us? Screamed the thief Lockmire. Lund, is there some kind of spell you can cast? No. Do you really think any magic would work on those things, Locke? We still need you to try. Cut it out. We don't have time for this. Maybe it just happens to be running this way. Marquis Raven. Go ahead of us and veer off to the side. Their voices were trembling. The Marquis followed their instructions and rode at the head of the group. He veered in a direction where there weren't many people. From right nearby came the bleating of a dark young, the sound of it threatening to crush his pounding heart. It's close. His forehead became a fountain of cold sweat. He was too scared to turn around, but he thought he felt disgustingly warm air behind him. Then he heard it again. Fuck. It's no good. It's aiming right for us. You know what to do, right, everyone? The response to the leader Boris's cry was magic spells. Reinforce armor. Lesser strength. All right. In that case, Marquis Raven will go to intercept it. Please just run without looking back. There was only one thing he could say in this situation to his men who had overcome their fear. Thank you. Okay. Let's do this. Marquis Raven could tell from the sounds that the distance between the horses of the former Orichalcum Plate adventurers behind him and his own was growing. He ducked his head to maintain a position that would lessen the drag of the wind. He wasn't sure how much time they could buy, but fleeing as fast as he could and making it back alive was the best way to pay respect to their faithful service. Fly, fireball. Impenetrable fortress. As he rode at the whims of his horse, the voices of the former adventurers, who seemed to be engaging in battle, reached his ears even against the wind whipping past him. But 2 seconds later, he couldn't hear them anymore. He could hear only the pounding of huge hooves. His heart jolted. He bit back a scream when he saw, in his lowered field of vision, a shadow falling across the earth. Noticing the huge shadow over him, though he fled at top speed, he grasped the fact that there was something long and thick reaching out. The horse galloped in a frenzy. It was already going faster than Marquis Raven could control. It had probably never run so fast in its life. Still, the shadow remained. I hate this. It was a shriek. He hadn't even intended to scream, but it was extremely loud. He felt something warm in his crotch. He opened his eyes wide, but still unable to look behind him, he just kept riding. He couldn't die yet. He didn't care what became of the kingdom. If the country was going to be destroyed, let it be destroyed. If antagonizing Ainz Ooal Gown meant death, then he would abandon his country and flee. How stupid. I was so stupid. I was a fool for coming to this battlefield. I knew how powerful Ainz Ooal Gown was, so I should have done anything to stay in the royal capital. I wish I hadn't given any thought to the kingdom's future. I hate this. I can't die yet. An image of a child appeared before him. It was his adorable son. That tiny life. He'd been gradually growing up. Sometimes he got sick. What a fuss the Marquis had made then. He was mortified, thinking back, of the way he had screamed, half mad, at his bewildered wife. Those chubby hands and rosy cheeks. He would surely grow into a young man who would be spoken of throughout the kingdom. The Marquis was sure the boy would surpass him. He had already caught glimpses of his potential. His wife said he was biased as a parent, but that was definitely not the case. He was so deeply grateful to his wife for bearing his precious child, although he was ashamed to say it too often. He had even been thinking of having another. He shouldn't have come to this battlefield. He should have stayed where he could hold those two in his arms. The pounding of the hooves stopped. When Marquis Raven turned around, more out of curiosity than bravery, he saw the dark young had ceased moving, as if they were frozen. With no idea where he was, he felt he had been plunged into a world of nightmares. The Four, that title of the Baharuth Empire's strongest warriors, seemed surprisingly superficial now. He'd been so proud of it. What a puny, pathetic creature that made him. That was how great a shock he had received. Nimble could hear muffled crying. They were the sobs of those whose fear and anxiety had broken their limits. They were the mournful cries of children, no, men who had regressed to children. The ones crying were Imperial Knights. Tons of them. He heard someone pleading, "Run." These were the solemn wishes of those who felt horrible for the ones swallowed up in that crucible, the gruesome slaughter taking place before their eyes. The kingdom had met such tragedy that their enemies, the Imperial Knights, were praying for them, hoping that even one more might escape. They had come to kill one another. But faced with such brutal slaughter, any human would be moved to compassion. Anyone who didn't feel something in this situation was a heartless brute, not a human. And Nimble and the other knights realized this was not merely a fire on the far shore. If they thought about the situation in terms of kingdom and empire, the fire was indeed on the other side. But if one thought in terms of humans and monsters, the fire was undoubtedly close. The Imperial Knights thought of the kingdom's soldiers as fellow humans, shedding tears at the tragedy they endured. "All right, I guess now's good." Reacting to Ainz's low voice, all eyes focused on him. With 60,000 men gathered, he hadn't been loud enough for those at the edges to hear. But they could tell that the man next to them had turned his head. And since they knew that Ainz Ooal Gown was on the other end of that gaze, it was only logical to follow suit and look, because everyone was terrified of his every move, for Ainz Ooal Gown was the father of this nightmare. Ainz slowly removed his mask. A white skull with neither skin nor flesh peered out. Outside of this situation, they might have thought he was wearing a mask beneath his mask. But it hit Nimble, and probably all the Imperial Knights, like a ton of bricks. This was his real face. Ainz Ooal Gown was a monster. They could accept it because their instincts already told them that a human could never wield so much power. Ainz slowly opened his arms. Like he was going to hug a friend, like a demon spreading its wings. It felt like he had expanded to double his size. Stillness. Ainz's gentle voice was bizarrely loud against the backdrop of the distant kingdom soldiers' screams. Applaud. Nimble stared at Ainz, agape, wondering what he could possibly be talking about. It seemed that everyone within earshot felt the same way, and as Ainz's word was passed on in whispers, the number of eyes on him grew. While everyone simply trained their eyes on him, Ainz spoke again. Applaud my supreme might. The first one to clap was the one standing on the other side of Ainz, from Nimble, Mare. As if that woke everyone up, a scattering of applause turned into a thunderous roar. Of course, it wasn't genuine. None of them wanted to clap for someone who orchestrated such a cruel slaughter. That wasn't war, but a massacre. A massacre of unimaginable scale. But there wasn't anyone who could say that. The thunderous applause was a manifestation of the knight's fear. It didn't seem possible for it to grow any louder, but they raised the voltage another few notches, because one of the black goats slowly changed course. It was facing the Imperial army. Along with the clapping came cheers like a war cry. The screams of the Imperial Knights in praise of Ainz Ooal Gown practically brought blood streaming from their throats. But the black goat's feet didn't stop. So the knights raised their voices even higher, thinking that it wasn't stopping because their voices hadn't satisfied him. But it didn't stop. That's when they snapped. Who knows who moved first? It might have just been that one of the knights shuddered. But the fear that had been poured into them readily burst. Wails from the depths of their souls could be heard here and there around the imperial camp. The army was shaken. Terrified by the crisis of one of the monsters that had overrun the kingdom's army now closing in on them, some knights abandoned their paralyzed horses and made a run for it. They had just been given a glimpse of hell. No matter how feeble their imaginations, each person thought that he would be next. The terror was contagious. At first, there had been only 100 or so runners, but their number increased by the second, and soon it had expanded to 60,000. Yes. The imperial army as a whole fell into a frightened panic, and its discipline collapsed. It was an ugly rout. Naturally, the knights had been taught how to withdraw properly. But they didn't have the composure to maintain discipline. In order to get away even 1 second faster, in order to get even one step closer to safety, they shoved their friends out of their way with all their might and ran. If someone was pushed from behind, he couldn't avoid losing his balance and falling. And if someone fell, the ones fleeing in terror behind him weren't about to give him time to stand up. Those who fell were crushed under the feet of the next men. The imperial enemy was racking up casualties not at their enemy's hand but at their own. Nimble was at his wits' end. He had no idea what to do. He wanted to run like everyone else, but he wouldn't be permitted to do that. Plus, not all the knights had run away. When he surveyed the position, there were a handful of men still on their horses, unmoving. It wasn't that they were too scared to run. They were thrilled to witness overwhelming power that humans could never hope to achieve. If a normal person saw a huge tornado heading straight for them, they would immediately try to get away. But others, despite knowing they would get killed, would be struck by the tornado's beauty and rendered immobile. The ones remaining were that sort of heretic. When the dark young arrived before Ainz, it bent its legs and lowered its tentacles. It must have been showing respect. The monster's unmonster-like pose made a twitching grin appear on Nimble's face. The young should have been spattered in blood, but the reason it didn't appear to be was that its skin had absorbed everything. Ainz sat on one of the tentacles, and several more reached down to stabilize and lift him up. The monster put him on its head. The plan was for me to hit them with one spell and then for the Imperial army to charge, but it doesn't look like that's going to happen. Nimble didn't say a word. It was true. The Empire had broken the contract proposed by the king of its ally. But he couldn't very well chew out the knights who had lost their nerve. He would probably defend their actions even before Jerknev. That was how overpowering the fear had been. I'm not blaming you. I can understand assuming that if you had charged, you might have been trampled along with them. If something like that had happened, I never would have been able to explain it to the Emperor. So, well, I'll work hard enough for both of us. Nimble glanced at the undead standing at attention. Are you going to send in those undead forces? I summoned these goats, after all, so I'll leave it up to them and just do a little cleanup. Mare, don't drop your guard, though. No, sir. You can count on me, Lord Ainz. Nimble was stunned. There was going to be a follow-up attack. By the one who could use such devastating magic himself. He could see an insatiable appetite for slaughter, the sort where this caster didn't plan to let anyone leave this battlefield alive. How can I put this? Haven't you done enough? Are you a demon? He meant to whisper it, but his voice came out much louder than expected, and Ainz, atop the black goat, turned his horrible face toward Nimble. As Nimble inwardly trembled in terror, Ainz shook his head. Don't misunderstand. I'm an undead. He was explaining that he wasn't an evil-doing demon but a life-hating undead. That was why he wouldn't let a single kingdom soldier escape, to take more lives. It made sense, but it was also the worst reply possible. If Ainz was slaughtering the living because he was an undead, then there was a perfectly good possibility that he would turn next on the Empire, another nation of the living. No, that was a future that would surely come to pass. Wondering what to do, under assault by confusion and fear, and lacking concentration, Nimble missed the last thing Ainz murmured. "Seems like we found who we were looking for." Ramposa III's position was at the rearmost area of the kingdom's army where countless nobles' flags fluttered. Until a little while ago, there had been a great many nobles around, but few remained. Most of them had fled, and those left could be counted very quickly. He wasn't angry at the court nobles for running away. "You should leave me and run, too." "You jest, Your Majesty. Please escape as fast as you can. If one of those comes, no one can save you." It was the vice captain of the Royal Select who gave the suggestion. "Escape and do what?" "Your Majesty, even if you remain here, there's nothing for you to do. Return to Irantal, that's where the counterattack will begin, don't you think?" Ramposa III smiled wryly. The suggestion grated on his ear. "You have one thing right. There's definitely nothing I can do here." Under the circumstances, he wouldn't be able to rally the broken, routed army. And it wasn't just him, it would be next to impossible no matter how great the commander. "Your Majesty. There's no time left. Men, get him out of here even if you have to tie him up." Gazef's subordinates leaped into action. Having decided that pointlessly remaining any longer would only endanger both his life and the lives of the others, Ramposa III stood up. "All right. I'll go. But do you really think we'll get away if we run now?" The earthquake-like footfalls were growing rapidly closer. Even in such a crisis, Ramposa III's tone was calm. It couldn't even be compared to the chaotic voices of the nobles who had been there up until moments before. "It has to be impossible. If we try to escape on horseback, they'll definitely give chase. They seem to be prioritizing attacks on people running in large groups, so this is the only chance we have." Ramposa III realized that was why they had put a whole mass of nobles on their horses and packed them off earlier. "So you will run and escape." He saw that a handful of the warriors had removed their armor and cast it aside. "These men will carry Your Majesty to safety." "What about you?" Not all the men had taken off their armor. The vice captain and others were still wearing theirs. "We're going to distract them by fleeing on our horses in the opposite direction." Ramposa III understood the warriors' feelings from the beautiful smiles on their faces. "No. You're our country's treasures. Do whatever you must to survive. I need you to serve my successor." "Of course. We're going to act as bait, but we don't intend to die." That was a lie. They did intend to die. No, they knew their fate was death. Ramposa III tried to persuade them, but the words wouldn't come out. Seeing their smiles, he felt like anything he said could only scratch the surface. The surrounding warriors began to remove Ramposa III's armor. A warrior in white armor stepped forward. It was Climb, who had exerted himself thus far as the only subordinate of the king's daughter, Princess Renner. "I'll also act as a diversion. I don't know if those monsters have eyes or not, but if I wave a flag, maybe I can catch their attention. This armor makes for a good target, as well." Climb had the kingdom's flag in his hands. The dirty footprints from where fleeing soldiers had stepped on it hinted at how dire their situation was. "Then I'll go with you." Brain Unglaus stood next to him. Ramposa III's most trusted aide, Gazef Stronov, said the man was a warrior equal to himself. Brain had joined this battle on behalf of Renner. He was essentially in the same category as Climb. "Are you sure? You aren't even a true subordinate of the princess." "What's that now?" "Well, don't worry about it. I jumped onto the front line during the demon disturbance and lived. I'll just pray good luck comes my way again. And I'll pray for you, too. The gods won't give up on us. They sent us a hero during the demon disturbance. I believe they'll bring us good luck again this time." Brain and the vice captain fist bumped in front of Ramposa 3 and went their separate ways. How horrible, where did I go wrong? Ramposa 3 groaned. Probably none of the warriors before his eyes would survive. The vice captain and Climb would die as bait. And what would become of Gazef, who rode off to stop the Dark Young? His eyes grew hot. He wanted to say, "Forgive me." They were throwing away their lives, their futures, to distract the enemy from an old man. But there was no way he could say such a thing. Though resigned to their deaths, they intended to struggle. In that case, return safely to Irantal. You'll have whatever you wish as a reward. Climb and Brain had started walking but turned around. I don't need a reward, Your Majesty. Princess Renner saved me. I couldn't possibly ask for anything more. My wish is for you to give my favorite kid in the kingdom the most beautiful princess as his bride. That's quite a reward you're asking for. Brain, what are you saying? I would have to start by giving that kid a peerage. Well, let's work hard. Now you really have to live through this and make it back, Climb? Climb just blinked furiously with his mouth hanging open, his warrior's determination of a moment ago vanished. Ramposa 3 forgot everything and smiled merrily in spite of himself. Now then, Your Majesty. I'm counting on you. Ramposa 3 armor had been removed, so the warriors picked him up. Your Majesty. Whether we can escape like this or not will depend on luck. If anything should, well, please forgive us. That's fine. I decided to use your idea. If our luck is bad, then there's no helping it. All right, Your Majesty. See you in Irantal. The vice captain and the others rode off on their horses. As if it had been waiting for that cue, the Dark Young changed directions. Okay. Let's go while everyone is drawing its attention. Among the turmoil of panicked soldiers, Gazef gazed steadily ahead and drew the kingdom's treasure, Razor Edge. He always won when he unsheathed this sword with its icy gleam. One could say the sword was proof of Gazef's victories. But today, it looked awfully feeble. Gazef was just so small, compared to the huge Dark Young making a beeline for him. If you get past me, you'll reach the king's position. Don't mind if I stop you here, Gazef said with a smile. A self-deprecating grin. Gazef had no chance of winning against the monster. Stopping it for so much as a second would be admirable, even for the captain of the Royal Select, the warrior whose name was known in all the nearby countries. Even for a man like him. Take the king and run. Lay down your lives, if necessary. Gazef gave orders to men who weren't present, his subordinates, as if he was praying. He had left the kingdom's strongest soldiers behind to guard the king. Of course they would succeed in protecting him from the savagery of those monsters. Even if they gave their lives, probably the most they could accomplish was to take a single attack as a meat shield. But that actually did mean success. If they took a hit, they would probably die, but if they could get their opponent to waste even one blow, then the king would live longer. It even became possible to hope that maybe, with 80 meat shields. Sorry. With his eyes fixed on the monster, which scattered blood and flesh as it rapidly approached, Gazef apologized to his men. They weren't with him, but he knew that even if he had told them directly, it would have been only for self-satisfaction. Still, he would have hated to die without saying it. Gazef exhaled sharply, feeling the ground shake beneath him. Then he held up the sword gripped tightly in his hand. How tenuous his blade seemed against the hulking form crushing humans as it closed in. If it had been a runaway carriage, he would have been able to stop it, no problem. If it had been a pouncing tiger, he could have dodged and immediately cut its head off. But he didn't have much of a chance of surviving a Dark Young. He exhaled deeply, and at the same time the flow of the people around him changed dramatically. Up until a moment ago, it had been a confused torrent, but now they parted around him. They essentially created a straight path between him and the Dark Young. Stomping more and more people apart beneath its feet, the Dark Young drew nearer. With his sword up, Gazef observed its entire body. Where could he attack that would be most effective? He used the martial art Detect Weak Point. But no weak spots? Did that mean it really had no weaknesses, or that the gap between their abilities was so great that they couldn't be read? Gazef didn't know. But he didn't lose hope. That outcome was within the realm of the expected. He used another martial art. It was a fairly big move, an ability that could be explained as a boost to the user's sixth sense, possibility perception. The difference in their physical abilities was so great that even if he boosted his physical strength, he would close the gap only slightly. Instead, he figured it would be better to rely on something else, his sixth sense. Come on, monster. As if the dark young heard his voice and listened, it headed straight for Gazef. The distance between them shrank before his eyes. Let's be honest. Gazef was scared. If it would have been permissible, he would have rather run away with the other soldiers. Even with possibility perception, he didn't sense anything. It was like being hurled into a completely black night. Once the dark young was closer, he could observe its condition in detail. Given the lack of scratches on its hooves, it was possible a mere sword wouldn't be enough to cut it. Considering how deep the earth was dented when stomped, it was definitely enough weight to be instantly fatal. The better he understood the monster, the stronger his fear grew. Gazef was experiencing greater fear than all the panicked soldiers running around. But he wouldn't show his back. The strongest warrior in the kingdom couldn't run away. He deactivated possibility perception and steadied his breathing. The dark young was nearly upon him. It was close enough that the dirt it was kicking up reached him. It ignored the other soldiers as if they were bugs by the side of the road and dashed on a crash course toward Gazef. But they didn't crash. The dark young's body twisted as if it had hit a wall, and it moved to go around Gazef. It happened so suddenly the monster's gait was thrown off, and even though it had an extra leg, it still nearly lost its balance. Gazef didn't think for a minute that it had run from him on its own. Perhaps it had simply gone toward an area where there was more prey. It must have thought that by shifting its course to the side it could trample more prey. Shaking the ground as it ran, the dark young passed by Gazef. Because it went by only about a yard away, the ground beneath his feet shook as if he was in a huge earthquake. If it was anyone besides Gazef, they would probably have fallen down. He focused on the dark young's big hooves as it tried to run away and swung his sword. If it was running away so fast, it meant its own speed would turn into a slashing weapon. The moment blade met hoof, a tremendous shock went through his sword hand. It was so strong he thought his arm might come off. Stomping legs left two trails in the dirt as they receded. Though he had avoided having his sword being ripped out of his hand, a sharp pain ran through his arm. The stress must have injured either his muscle or his tendon. With ragged breath, he scowled at the hulking form behind him. Not too far from Gazef, the dark young stopped for the first time since it had begun its rampage. A single tentacle overshadowed him. Fear pierced his entire body. Gazef promptly held his sword up. That instant an incredible shock was transmitted through his sword, and his whole body lifted into the air. Gazef couldn't see anything, but he figured he must have been swiped aside by the tentacle. He flew quite a distance. After an unbelievably long time in the air, Gazef fell to the ground and rolled more than a few times. But it wasn't the rolling of a corpse that had been thrown, but of a thrown human actively trying to slow his momentum. Whipping his creaking body, he slowly stood up. He glared at the now farther off dark young. Just one blow. His hand was broken. That his sword wasn't broken was surely thanks to sheer luck. All emotion had drained out of Gazef's face. Why was I spared? Why didn't it attack again? Had it decided he wasn't a worthy opponent? That seemed the most likely explanation. It wasn't a crushing defeat. He hadn't even been able to get anywhere near. Crimson blood flowed from the lip he was biting. Then he suppressed the mounting pain and desperately took off running. Even if he couldn't win, even if he could take only one more hit, he had to protect the king. But the feet he had moved so resolutely stopped after only a few paces, because when he saw another dark young coming, there was no mistake. Toward him, he realized why his life had been spared. There was a king sitting on a throne of tentacles above the dark young. But there was something strange about his face. It was all bone, and Ainz had no doubt this was a type of monster, called an undead. He wasn't such a fool that he couldn't understand who the king was. Ainz Ooal Gown, sir. So you weren't human, I see. The special unit from the theocracy. Ainz had no trouble understanding that the being who handily annihilated an opponent that had been impossible for him was not human. I see. Why would a being with that much power be human? Why was I even thinking that? Sir Stronov. He knew from the hoarse voice who it was before even turning around. Two familiar faces were running toward him. You guys are all right, then. Climb and Brain didn't seem to be injured either. Climb's white armor wasn't even dirty. They hadn't scrambled to flee, so they must have been extraordinarily lucky. More than anything, I'm glad to see you're all right. I didn't think we would die, and we didn't. But I guess it's not over yet. Both of their gazes settled on what Ainz had been looking at until a moment ago. What in the world? There can only be one of those, Climb, a monster who could tame those monsters. That's Ainz Ooal Gown. That's... How? I'm sorry. Looking over, he saw Climb was trembling. The tense look on the boy's face told him the shivers weren't from excitement. Don't worry, Climb. It's nothing to be ashamed of. I mean, shit. He's the third ultra-powerful being now. What the hell has been going on with my life lately? Brain got into a fighting stance, exuding an overpowering swordsman spirit. Ainz wondered just a bit about his content expression, though, because it seemed out of place. I can't run away, either. Climb and Brain stood on either side of Ainz. Squelching through chunks of scattered flesh, the dark young walked right up to Ainz. Screams could be heard in the distance, but this place was quiet. It was almost like this area had been cut away from the rest of the world. Ainz's gaze went from Ainz, uninterestedly to Brain, and then stopped on Climb for a moment. Then he shrugged and turned back to Ainz. You seem well, Sir Stronov. You seem well, too, Sir Gown. Or can I say well? It would be rude if you ceased being human since the last time we met. I haven't changed since then. Ainz chuckled and hopped off the dark young. Probably due to some sort of magic, gravity didn't seem to pull him so much, and he fell slowly. At first, Ainz thought it might be the fly spell that everyone knew of, but when he considered that it was this great caster using it, he felt there was a good chance it was a higher tier spell he had never heard of. It really has been a while, Sir Stronov. Since back at Karn. Indeed, Sir Gown. So, whatever can I do for you? I'm sure it can't just be that you happened to spot an acquaintance on the battlefield and came over to say hello. Well, I don't like using flowery language, and a roundabout phrasing wouldn't be appropriate here. So, I'll tell you straight. Ainz slowly extended a bony hand. Not out of hostility, but out of friendship. Come work for me. For a moment, Ainz's eyes widened. At the same time, he heard Climb and Brain gasp on either side of him. He never thought this great caster would say such a thing to him. If you agree to come work for me, Ainz snapped his fingers, although it wasn't clear how, with his skeleton hand. Unsure what was about to happen to him, Ainz trembled. But nothing about him changed physically or mentally, and he didn't feel anything. Look around. Ainz surveyed the area. As expected, nothing was, so you stopped them? All of the dark young had ceased moving. With their legs raised mid-stomp, they looked like statues. This is temporary. What happens next depends on your answer. If you refuse, I'll give the young I summoned another order. I'm sure you can guess what it will be without my telling you. Ainz blinked. Even if he took Ainz hostage and forced him to work under him, Gazef would do more than lack loyalty, he would be sure to plot a betrayal from the inside. Gazef didn't think Ainz could have overlooked that. So there had to be some other reason he would ask such a thing. Gazef didn't understand. But there had to be a reason that a being of that power, who could control a corps of monsters, would want him. What? Gazef Stronov, come work for me. The bony hand was there, extended. If he took that hand, many lives would be saved. Gazef's heart wavered, because he had been given a chance to save the people of the kingdom. But he couldn't take that hand. This decision is wrong. It's only for my own satisfaction. 100 out of 100 people would be sure to call him a damn fool. But Gazef still couldn't betray the kingdom. He emphatically shook his head. I refuse. His Majesty has favored me, and for that, I owe him. Thus, my sword belongs to the king. I cannot yield it to you. Even if more of his subjects die as a result. You engaged in battle prepared to give your life to save Karn. Now that same man would abandon lives he could save? The words cut Gazef's heart like a knife. Still, Gazef Stronov could not take the hand of Ainz Ooal Gown. The captain of the Royal Select couldn't betray the kingdom. That was Gazef's loyalty. Perhaps irritated by his silence, Ainz shrugged. You're a foolish man. Well, then, without letting Ainz say anything else, Gazef pointed razor edge at him. What? His wounds from the goat hadn't completely healed even with the power of the talisman he was using. But that wasn't why the tip of his sword was shaking. Even so, Gazef was gushing fighting energy from his entire body. Sir Gown, I apologize for this impudence as someone in your debt, but I challenge thee to a duel. Ainz's face had neither skin nor flesh. Since Gazef couldn't know what expression he was making, it was impossible to read what he was thinking. But he had the feeling somehow that he was dumbstruck. And apparently the other two behind him were, too. Even if no one spoke, their shock was palpable. Are you serious? Of course. You'll die, you know. I'm sure I will. And yet you still. I wasn't really planning on killing you, so you have a death wish? Well, I didn't think so, but here we are. What are you thinking? I can't understand your thought process. If you were challenging me because you knew you could win, I would get it. And in the case that you thought you had a chance. But you're convinced you'll lose. Have you lost the ability to make sane decisions? The enemy king has come within reach of my sword. I think it's only a matter of course that I would try to take his head. Certainly, we are in close physical proximity. But it also looks like there's an insurmountable gap between us. Are you calling me blind? One of the tentacles of the dark young behind Ainz whipped out and gouged the ground next to Gazef. With Gazef's dynamic visual acuity, he couldn't even see it happen. Maybe I am, Sir Gown. Are you getting cocky because I said I wouldn't kill you? Gazef smiled deep down. I certainly don't intend to be, not one bit. I just want to do what I should as captain of the Royal Select, that's all. If you come at me, I will mercilessly destroy you. That's a fact. I bet it is. So I can say all that, and you won't change your mind? What a shame. As a collector, I'd rather not kill a rare one like you. Gazef didn't have the slightest intention of backing down. This was a 1 in a million chance. For starters, Ainz had so many subordinates, yet here he was in front of Gazef with no entourage. On top of that, he was so arrogant in his strength that he wasn't even moving to use the dark young behind him. A chance like this would never come again. His opponent was at unreachable heights. But here and now, this was the moment that reaching him might be possible. The next time they met, he would surely be surrounded by a crowd of guards, as befitted a caster who would be vulnerable in a close-quarters battle. He would never stand within a sword's reach. That was why Gazef challenged him to a duel. There was also one other reason. It would be betting on a very slim chance, but it was worth a shot. Gazef declared his intentions formally. King of Darkness, Ainz Ooal Gown. I am captain of the Royal Select of the Riestai's Kingdom, Gazef Stronov. And I challenge thee to a duel. Gazef. Captain, finally unable to stand it any longer, Brain screamed and Climb moaned. But Gazef paid them no mind and continued. If you accept them, King of Darkness, I would like to designate these two as the witnesses of our single combat. Ainz shrugged. Gazef took it as permission to do as he liked and nodded. Wait. Wait, Gazef. I would die with you any day. I won't let you go alone. Your Majesty, King of Darkness, I beg you. I realize this is impertinent, but it's a wish from my heart. Would you fight us both at the same time? I'm sure it wouldn't be difficult for you. Hearing Brain's miserable screams, Gazef thought, yeah, I knew it. Brain's content expression earlier was that of a warrior who had made up his mind. He had resolved to be killed with Gazef by Ainz Ooal Gown. But Gazef wouldn't accept that. He couldn't. Brain unglows. You would sully my warrior's resolve? Brain looked shocked. Listen, Sir Stronov. I don't mind fighting both of you. That won't be necessary, King of Darkness. I am your sole opponent. You needn't lay a hand on either of them. The red flames in the vacant orbits of Ainz's skull gleamed brighter. I see. I've seen those eyes before. You have the will of a man who is ready to die. They're strong eyes. I admire them. Ainz spoke as if he was another human. All right. I accept your proposal. You and me in an unknown PvP match. Brain fell to his knees. Gazef couldn't see his lowered face, but raindrops were falling onto the red earth. I'm sorry, he mentally said to him. I'll give you back your corpse in pristine condition. You can use resurrection and no need. At Gazef's reply, both friends and foe were speechless. I don't wish to be resurrected. I don't mind if you throw my body away here. He didn't think there was anything wrong with resurrection magic. But he didn't like it. A person had only one life to live. That's why the decision people made to risk their lives carried such weight. And it wouldn't be in the kingdom's interests for him to come back to life either. If Gazef died, it would be announced both internally and externally that the king had lost someone precious to him. That might soften the anger directed at him by his subjects who lost someone in the war. This was the selfishly operating captain of the Royal Select's final act of loyalty. Ignoring the surprise around him, Gazef smiled, seemingly liberated. Then let us begin. You two, watch my last fight all the way to the end. Climb never imagined Brain would ever show such vulnerability. The Brain that Climb knew was strong, easygoing, and elusive. But the man hanging his head held not even a shadow of him. Still, Climb didn't think he was weak. Brain. Aren't you going to do that for me? Gazef asked without turning around. Brain didn't move. Climb could sense his frustration from the way his hands clutched at the dirt. Still, he couldn't not say it. It's what Sir Stronov wants. He didn't think Gazef Stronov could win. That's why Climb and Brain had to fulfill Gazef's wish. Brain slowly stood up. So much heat. Climb nearly skittered back. Brain seemed to be giving off a fiery warmth. I've acted pathetic in front of you so many times, Climb. I'm all right now. I'm going to burn his heroic figure into my eyes. Thank you. What was the relationship between Gazef Stronov and Brain Unglaus? Climb didn't know. Especially about Brain. He lost to Gazef and trained hard with the sword. That was the Brain that Climb knew, but he had the feeling their relationship wasn't so simple. Very well, Sir Stronov. May I see your sword? I'd like to examine it briefly, Ainz said with utter calm as if he was inquiring about the day's weather. Enchanted swords were invested with all sorts of abilities. To examine it was to examine the hand of one's opponent. Common sense dictated it was not the sort of proposition that should be accepted. Climb wasn't the only one to think that. Apparently, Brain felt the same, because his eyes went huge when he saw what happened next. Gazef turned his sword 180 degrees and offered the hilt to Ainz. Gazef, have you lost all interest in winning? Brain, don't be rude. The King of Darkness isn't that sort of person. Ainz took the sword and cast a spell. Then he smiled in high spirits. This sword's amazing. Ainz did what Gazef had done moments ago and offered him the hilt. Sir Stronov, how much do you know about that sword's power? I know everything. This sword is so impossibly sharp, it can cut gold like paper. What a pity. That's only the first thing it can do. What? What in the world do you mean, King of Darkness? In a word, it's a sword that can kill me. With that, we meet the basic criteria of having a duel. If I fought against someone who was wielding a weapon that couldn't even scratch me, it'd be nothing but an execution. How rude of me to have lumped you in with the sewer rats who barged into my home, Ainz said as he suddenly pulled a dagger out of the air. Without a moment's hesitation, he pressed the dazzling blade hard against his face and dragged it across. But it didn't seem to hurt him at all. These kinds of things enchanted with weak magic can't hurt me. Incidentally, the amount of mana is the same as that sword you have, Sir Stronov. But that sword makes all that possible. It ignores all the common sense I know. I wonder, if I win, would you mind if I took it? Gazef winced. Give me a break. This sword is one of the kingdom's treasures. So this is a PvP match where we'll return any drops. Fine with me. I appreciate it, King of Darkness. After returning the sword, Ainz rubbed his chin pensively and then began taking steps away from Gazef one by one, as if measuring. This should be a relative distance of about 5 yards. Other than that, we don't have a countdown, so we'll need a signal. You with the white armor. Come up with some sort of start signal. Suddenly getting called on, Climb shuddered. I'm counting on you, Climb. Well, I have my magic handbells, so how about if I rang one of those? The two combatants silently nodded to show they accepted Climb's suggestion. Gazef aimed the point of his sword at Ainz's size and filled his body with energy. To Climb, behind him, it seemed like his muscles were actually expanding. His swordsman spirit was overwhelming. Climb had never seen the true force of the captain of the Royal Select. But the way he looked now seemed like a mirage, bizarrely distant and fleeting. Sir Stronov, this was probably the last time he would see him alive. You don't know that for sure. Brain suddenly contradicted him. It's not a done deal that Gazef will die. It's extremely slim, but he does have a chance at winning. He has an ace move. You mean sixfold slash of light? Brain smiled calmly. No, it's the ultimate martial art, way beyond that. He has that, so, I had no idea. Readying his handbell, Climb gazed at Gazef from the side as the warrior, with his sword up, focused every fiber of his being, the steely profile of the man known in the surrounding countries as the captain of the Royal Select. Yeah. One of the kingdom's former adamantite-plate adventurers, Besterklof D. Laufen, developed it, but he was too old to use it. If my strongest move, Nail Clipper, is the combination of multiple arts used at once, Gazef's is the strongest single art. With that, he might be able to reach even Ainz Ooal Gown. That might be why he chose to face him solo, Brain thought as he watched in earnest, unblinking. Climb gulped. The hand holding his bell felt heavy. Once the bell rang, Gazef's fate would be decided. Want me to do it instead? Thank you, but, Brain murmured that he understood and didn't say anything else. Climb held up the bell, with a prayer that Gazef would win. And then, the bell rang out even louder than he expected. Focused to the extreme, Gazef dashed forward with unimaginable speed. Climb and Brain were determined not to blink, their eyes opened wide, but even faster than that, the world stopped. You really need a way to handle time. He had used instacast silent magic, stop time, so Gazef was frozen in front of Ainz with his sword raised over his head. When time was frozen, all attacks were meaningless. Even if he hit Gazef with attack magic, he wouldn't be able to do any damage. That's why Ainz calculated out the times and cast Delay Magic, True Death. It was a tier 9 spell. He didn't use it much, because Grasp Heart was so easy and fun. If magic was ineffective while time was stopped, all one had to do was cast in a way that the magic took effect right after the temporal magic expired. It was a basic combo, but because of how difficult it was to get the timing right, only about 5% of magic-using classes could pull it off. It goes without saying, but after spending a ridiculous amount of time practicing, Ainz could do it. This is goodbye, Gazef Stronov. I didn't dislike you. The spell was lifted, and time returned to the world. And before anything else happened, the magic took effect. Gazef fell in slow motion. What? Climb and Brain had no idea what had happened. The moment Gazef dashed forward, he began to crumple. Ainz caught his body. His sword dropped feebly to the ground. The duel was already decided. But they couldn't understand it. They had absolutely no idea what had occurred. What in the... You think I know? Brain roared. Why? Stand up, Gazef. But Brain's wish was coldly denied. He's already dead. Ainz laid Gazef on the ground with correct etiquette, as if he respected him. Then he slowly closed his eyes, which had been popped wide open. The other two came closer, and with his eyes on Gazef's face, Ainz spoke to them. Seeing him take on a fight he couldn't possibly win reminded me of that one time. Out of respect for the captain, I won't have the Dark Young attack anymore. After I make up his body, I'll send it to you. No, you don't need to do that. We'll take him back. I don't want any favors from you. Climb breathed a sigh of relief. He thought Brain might challenge Ainz even though he knew he couldn't win, but it didn't seem like that was going to happen. Ainz just said, and abruptly straightened up. You can't resurrect someone from the insta-death spell I used, True Death, with a low-level resurrection spell. Also, tell the people of the kingdom, if you submit to me, I will have mercy on you. Ainz floated into the air. He showed them his unprotected back, but neither Brain nor Climb could do anything as shameless as attacking him. Ainz sat on the Dark Young's tentacles. It was like a horrific throne. If you turn over the Irantal area soon, these fellows won't rampage through the royal capital. Tell that to the king. The Dark Young whirled around and headed back toward the Imperial Army's position, although the Imperial Army itself seemed to have started withdrawing at some point. The other four also seemed to be making their way back. Climb, I have one favor to ask you. Do you mind if I take Gazef back? All right. I'll take his sword. So many people died. I wonder how many. What is going on? I don't know. But if a being like that is going to rule this land, there will definitely be another war in the future. And the casualties will probably be even greater next time. Following behind Brain, who had shouldered Gazef, Climb thought of the kingdom's gloomy future. He felt like Brain's prediction was undoubtedly right. What mattered, then, was what he should do in that situation. And what he was even capable of doing. And most importantly of all, I have to at least secure Princess Renner's future. Climb balled his fists tightly and made up his mind. He would do anything to protect his master. End of the 4th chapter. If you like my content, join me on Patreon, where you can find more and exclusive novels. Also, you can leave a donation by clicking the Super Thanks button. Thank you very much for your support. Epilogue. A freezing evening wind blew by. Brain Unglaus's hair whipped in it, and his clothes flapped. His white breath and low murmur were scattered and carried away by a northerly gust. He felt like he was going to freeze to his core. Brain was alone atop the rampart tower the three of them had climbed before, deploying. There was nothing there but darkness. In the battle on Katsa Plain, no, the massacre, a huge number of the kingdom's people had died. He remembered running from the battlefield for dear life. The people who had fled looked so pitiful and ragged, their gaits unsteady. Even Brain, who had fought through many life and death battles, would never be able to forget the hellish scene caused by that single caster. Despite its walls, Ainz Ooal couldn't be called safe, but the soldiers who somehow managed to make it this far practically collapsed with fatigue, falling into a deep slumber. Up in the empty rampart tower, Brain exhaled deeply once again. Then he silently looked up at the sky. Man, I kind of don't care about anything anymore. He looked at his hands. The weight of that man's lifeless body still hadn't left him. Even if he tried to forget it, he couldn't. He had been a great warrior, as well as Brain's rival, one step ahead of him. The loss he felt, the loss of Gazef, was tremendous. Gazef was more to Brain than a good rival. Because that man had stood before him in the tournament, because he broke him back when he had such a big head, because of Brain's passion to defeat Gazef someday, those were things that made Brain the person he was now. Brain Unglaus was birthed, raised, and trained by Gazef Stronov. Gazef's strength was the strength that Brain was meant to spend his life trying to surpass, just as a father existed as a wall to be overcome. But now the person he was supposed to surpass was gone. Gazef had towered before him like a mountain to the last. Shaltir Bloodfallen had shown Brain true strength. And for a time, he wasn't able to recover from it. He understood now that because he had been so confident in his strength, which he had made his sole foundation, he was fragile and weak when Shaltir shattered it. But Gazef was different. Ainz Ooal Gown. He must be as powerful as Shaltir Bloodfallen. Gazef stood before him and issued a challenge. Gazef didn't take him on in single combat for some pathetic reason like surviving. His attitude had been completely different from when Brain waved his sword recklessly at Shaltir, sobbing. Then why did he do it? I don't get it. Why didn't you run away? He painfully choked out the words. Why did you choose death? That monster was going to let you go. You should have built up your strength. Why did you? If I have to die, I wanted to go with you. If he couldn't surpass Gazef, his wish was to die beside him. Brain looked at the weapon on his hip. He'd been authorized to borrow Razor Edge temporarily. Drawing the razor-sharp blade, Brain used a martial art. Fourfold slash of light. It was the move that Gazef had used to defeat him in the tournament. 4 flashes sliced through the parapet. There was virtually no resistance. The sword was so sharp, it felt like cutting through water. I even learned this because of you. I admired you so much. I wanted to die together, if it was possible. Why didn't you let me fight beside you? Why didn't you tell me to die? Brain buried his face in his hands. The backs of his eyes grew hot, but the tears didn't fall. Just then, Brain heard the clacking of footsteps. He could think of only one person who would come here. It's true that you get sentimental with age. I don't think the sorrow of losing someone important to you has anything to do with age. It was the hoarse voice he expected. Sorry, Climb, for making you handle everything. Brain rubbed his eyes and sheathed his sword before turning around. Climb was standing there with a solemn expression on his face, still in his armor. Well, I probably wouldn't have been much use anyhow, right? And under the circumstances, there's probably no one trying to kill the king at the moment. So what's the latest? Since Prince Barbaro still hasn't returned, the plan is to send out a search party tomorrow. Apparently, since they couldn't use soldiers, they would hire adventurers. Then there were no objections regarding the transfer of Ainz Ooal. All the nobles are in favor, and the king agreed as well. Apparently, even the members of the king's faction agreed. The king's faction had gained power after the demon disturbance. That was how they had mustered such a large army for the war, but when that army suffered a catastrophic defeat, there was major backlash. Moreover, none of the nobles would be harmed by handing over this area, which was a part of the king's domain. If it would help them stay alive, surely they had no reason to be against the deal. So this time, the king's faction lost power, while the nobles' faction grew stronger. What would happen next? Clym suddenly realized he was trembling. It wasn't anger but fear. Recalling what had happened, his fractured heart cried out, as if that absolute despair was still nearby. Just remembering it all frightens me. Had it only been the extraordinary strength of a person in crisis? Brain thought back to when Clym had stood beside him to fight the King of Darkness. Then he thought he might know the answer to his question. Hey, tell me. Why did Gazef challenge him to single combat? Clym looked at him questioningly. Brain wondered if he hadn't worded it clearly enough, but before he could even open his mouth to say more, Clym spoke. This is purely my personal thoughts, but would that be all right with you? Sure, tell me whatever you think. I think he wanted us to see. See what? The power of the King of Darkness, King Ainz Ooal Gown. And, I think he wanted to create a future. A future? Yes. I think he wanted us to have some record, some strategy, for the next time. A shocking realization struck Brain from his head to his toes like lightning. There could be no other reason. Clym was exactly right. The man must have risked his life to draw out even the slightest bit of intelligence. Brain didn't think the King of Darkness would accept a close-quarters battle without an entourage. But Gazef had bet on the miracle of it happening once more. And who did he want to give that possibility to? Brain smiled self-deprecatingly. You couldn't even manage to think that far, Brain? Now that I know how Gazef felt, how should I live my life? When Clym could no longer tolerate the silence after Brain sank deep into thought, he asked, by the way, you aren't going to resurrect Sir Stronov? Gazef's not that sort of guy. And casting the spell didn't guarantee resurrection. He had heard that people who were satisfied with their life refused. The king won't accept that. Probably not, but he's not coming back. It's strange, it is. I don't understand what Sir Stronov was thinking. I can't help but think the right thing to do would be to come back and remain loyal. That's all right for you, Clym. If I die, don't resurrect me. With that dissatisfaction hanging over me, I wouldn't feel alive. I would want you to resurrect me. I want to devote myself to Princess Renner until there is nothing left. Of course, only do it if you can afford it. There was only one caster in the kingdom who could use resurrection magic. She would probably charge an astronomical, and fair, price to bring someone back. She made a special exception for the demon disturbance, since all the adventurers had formed a team, but usually resurrection required quite a lot of gold. It was an eye-popping sum that a commoner or soldier could save for all their lives and still never have enough. That applied to Clym as well. Brain didn't speak his thoughts aloud, that the princess would probably pay for it. His only reply was, I see. Another silence descended, and this time Brain broke it. I wanted to defeat him, Clym didn't say anything. And Brain didn't want him to. Even if he told Clym the whole story, it wouldn't matter. But for some reason, he wanted to spit it out, something that had been building up in his heart. A long time ago, I lost to him. So I wanted to win the next time. But it's impossible now. I can't escape. Brain looked up at the night sky. Damn it all, Brain. What should I do? What should I do with these thoughts of Gazef? Well, let's see. What am I fretting about, really? I have two choices. To follow his wishes or not. So I'll have to win. I see. There's only one answer. Brain broke into a savage smile and thrust razor edge toward the sky. Why would I do what you wanted? Brain roared from the pit of his stomach. You asshole, you chose death. You took the easy way out. I hope you're humiliated over there in the next world. I'm gonna surpass you in my own way. Clym. Let's drink. Booze. We're gonna go nuts. Brain didn't know what to do. But he had no interest in inheriting Gazef's way of doing things and working. He would never best his rival that way. He knew he would remember Gazef time after time. But for just a moment, he wanted to forget him. Putting his arm over the shoulder of a bewildered Climb, he forced the young man to join him as he set off walking. His hands felt a tiny bit lighter. End of epilogue. If you like my content, join me on Patreon, where you can find more and exclusive novels. Also, you can leave a donation by clicking the Super Thanks button. Thank you very much for your support. A brand new chapter. Everyone was waiting for spring. That was especially true in the farming villages, where they could feel the soil coming back to life, but it was true for those in the royal capital as well. Of course, the way they felt it was by the disappearance of firewood and other heating fees. But the day spring came to Ainz, there was only stillness. The main road was deserted, as if everyone had died. But inside the houses lining it with their shutters drawn, although looking closely, they were open a crack, the presence of people could be felt. They were peeking outside with bated breath. It was the day that Ainz was transferred to Ainz Ooal Gown and became a city of the Nation of Darkness. The first castle gate opened, and the bells rang out in welcome. After an appropriate pause, the second gate opened, and the bells rang again. Between the second and third gates was the area where most of the people lived. The reason the residents hadn't fled the city was that they knew that even if they ran, their lives would be hopeless. Even those who had attained the status of master or craftsman in Ainz would have to start over as apprentice in a new city. In a city with history, vested interests existed as a matter of course. It was only natural that an outsider would start from the lowest level. In other words, even if they went to another city, most people wouldn't be able to find proper work and would spend the rest of their lives in a slum. Those with nowhere to run to, almost everyone, remained. But even these people would run if their lives were in danger. Of course they would. What they knew of their new lord, no, king, was that he was horrible. For instance, he was a caster who massacred the kingdom's army. For instance, he was cold-blooded and immortal. For instance, he was a monster who loved bathing in the blood of children. They had heard all sorts of rumors, none of them good. That was why they were all hiding behind closed doors, in the shadows of their windows, waiting to catch a glimpse of Ainz Ooal Gown. Soon, his party came down the main road. Everyone who saw him was rendered speechless, because he looked exactly as the rumors said. The first person was fine. At the head of the group was a beautiful woman who shone like the moon. She wore a snow-white dress and had lustrous black hair and skin like white marble. Her bejeweled appearance was so overwhelming that it left no room for lust or envy. But the horns growing out of her head, the black wings sprouting from her hips, and more than anything, her impossible beauty was proof that she wasn't human. Following the peerless, goddess-like beauty came soldiers. At that point, the residents shivered. From the differences in armor, they could tell there were two groups. To name the first group, perhaps Knights of Death? Each knight carried a tower shield that covered 3/4 of their body in their left hand and a flamberge in their right. Under ragged raven-black capes, their hulking bodies, well over 6 feet tall, were covered in full-plate armor made of black metal with a pattern like crimson blood vessels running over it. Sharp spikes jutted out here and there, making the suit an embodiment of violence. Their helmets had demon horns and open faces that left the beings' rotting features visible. In their vacant eye sockets, their hatred for living things and anticipation of slaughter burned red. As a name for the second group, Warriors of Death seemed appropriate. They carried long-handled, single-edged swords and had an array of different weapons on their hips: hand axes, maces, crossbows, whips, short spears. All their equipment had marks that showed they were well used. They were over 6 feet tall and armored but lightly. It was unclear what animal's leather it was, but they wore beat-up leather armor and wound curse wraps, bandages with curses written on them, around their arms, face, and so on. Peeking out from beneath the bandages were, like the other group, crumbling features that definitely didn't belong to a living creature. Every member in the group seemed inordinately powerful, but when the people saw the palanquin they were carrying, their shock was overwritten by a new awe and forgotten. The undead seated on it radiated the overwhelming presence of death and gave off a swirling black haze. Behind him shone a black halo. Everyone knew immediately this being was Ainz Ooal Gown. We can't live under a creature like that. This goes far beyond the threat of death. Many of them were convinced of that, but suddenly a door flew open. Everyone who peered desperately through tiny gaps of cover to see what was happening saw a boy running. He had something clenched in his hand as he raced toward Ainz Ooal Gown's grotesque procession. A deathly pale woman who seemed to be his mother was running after him. "Give Daddy back." His young, high-pitched voice echoed horribly loudly. "Give Daddy back, you monster." He wound up and threw something. It was a stone. The little rock he had been grasping flew toward the parade, probably at Ainz Ooal Gown. Perhaps because the boy had been nervous, the stone fell far short of its target and rolled over the dirt. Coming after him, the boy's mother looked like she might drop dead at any moment, as though she fully understood what their fate would be. She scooped her boy up from behind, desperately trying to shield him with her own body. "He's just a child. I beg you, please forgive him." The beautiful woman smiled in response to the mother's frantic plea. "We're saved." Anyone would think that and feel relief. It was such a gentle, motherly smile. It was disrespectful to Lord Ainz. The punishment is death. When had she taken it out? The beautiful woman was suddenly wielding a gigantic bardiche. Her strength was undoubtedly inhuman. It was easy to imagine how it would be used, and that imagining could be said to have been correct. "What a rotten animal you've raised. You should be ashamed as a stock breeder of how meager the price of its meat will be." Realizing what their fate would be as the beautiful woman approached, the mother squeezed her son tightly. "Please. My son, please at least spare my son. I don't care what happens to me. I beg you." "What are you talking about? I'm not going to kill you. Lord Ainz is not partial to senseless killing. I won't kill anyone who hasn't committed a crime. Relax and wait for that ground beef in your hands to be ready. My personal favorite is deep-fried meat patties." No one knew how she would kill the boy in his mother's arms. But although everyone knew the boy's short life would end in a few seconds, no one rushed out to try to save him. The onlookers wanted to avoid seeing the coming bloodshed, but they couldn't tear their eyes away. Both mother and child seemed bound by the beautiful woman's ghastly energy, they didn't move a muscle. "Regret your ill-mannered actions toward the loftiest one of this world and die." The moment she was about to swing her huge weapon, the ground jolted. The source was a giant sword that stuck into the earth between the pitiable pair and the woman. There was no one in this city who didn't know that sword, or its owner. The living legend. The undefeated warrior. The great, kind hero. Upon the arrival of the one person who could save the poor mother and child, everyone shouted the name of the sword's owner in their minds. It was the dark warrior, Mammon. The man clad in raven-black armor leisurely appeared on the road and pulled the sword out of the earth. He waved it in a huge arc to shake the dirt off. He already had a sword in his other hand, falling into a combat stance as he faced the beautiful woman. "You're being awfully rough on a kid who threw a stone. No one's going to want to marry you." "How rude, but when it's you saying it, I feel fine. If someone has been disrespectful to Lord Ainz, it doesn't matter whether they're an adult or a child. They must all die. And what if I said I wouldn't allow that? I would consider it a revolt against the king of this land and crush you." "I see. Well, that's not bad. But don't think you can take my life so easily. No, this is the place you'll die, then come at me." Mammon dexterously brandished his two swords and prepared for battle. His bold, and not only that but commanding, attitude was appropriately heroic. "You guys, protect Lord Ainz," the beautiful woman ordered the warriors who had backed up with the palanquin. Then she held up her bardiche. The spectators' feeling that Mammon could win for sure was negated by the equally intense opposing forces. They knew instinctively that this woman was as powerful a warrior as Mammon. The fighters closed the distance between them slowly, by fractions of a stride. The one who diffused the volatile atmosphere was Ainz Ooal Gown himself. Perhaps by magic? He silently flew out of the palanquin and alighted on the ground, then grabbed the beautiful woman's shoulder from behind. "Lord Ainz." Then he brought his face close to the woman's ear and whispered something. Her face melted into a gentle, lovey smile. "Understood, Lord Ainz. I'll do as you say." After bowing to Ainz, she pointed the bardiche at Mammon again, but there was none of the bloodthirstiness of before. "I didn't ask your name. Tell me it now." "I'm Mammon." "I see. Mammon. I ask you, do you think you can beat us?" "No, it'd be impossible. If I went in meaning to die, I could probably only kill one of you." Hearing that, the people of the city were assailed by despair. Such a great hero could kill only one of the monsters. And if I fought at full strength, lots of people would die in the resulting battle. "I can't do that." "What a fool you are. You have such outstanding power, and yet for these weaklings, you would, I seem to have spoken in vain. Apparently, Lord Ainz has a proposition for you. You should be grateful. Say you surrender to the army of Massacre. Are you out of your mind? How rude. Lord Ainz has no intention of ruling this city through slaughter and despair. It's not as if he gains anything by killing humans, you know. But even if he said that, the people here won't believe him, so you must work at his side." "What do you mean?" "Going forward, there may be others like that imbecile who threw the rock at Lord Ainz. If that happens, take off that person's head. That way, Lord Ainz won't have to make the innocent people of the city suffer. All you need to do is stand watch." "I see. So I would serve close to him as an observer?" "Not quite. As I said, you will kill rebels with your own hands. He's telling you to be a representative of the city, as well as the law enforcer. I have no interest in following your evil laws. We're not planning on enacting any that are so evil. So what will you do? If you won't devote your sword to Lord Ainz, you're a dangerous individual, meaning I'll have to kill you now, no matter how many bystanders become involved." Mammon looked around. "I was traveling on my way somewhere else. I didn't plan on becoming anyone's underling. If that's your answer, that's fine. Then shall we begin our death match and wrap up all these humans in the ensuing battle?" "Wait. Don't jump to conclusions. I haven't said what I'm going to do yet. Also, I have a partner. What will happen to her?" "She can serve with you." What other answer could there be? The old me would have prioritized reaching the destination of my journey, but I seem to have gotten unexpectedly attached to this city. "Will it work for you even if I don't surrender?" Ainz approached the woman again and whispered in her ear. "He says he'll allow it. Mammon, work hard for Lord Ainz." "Got it. Just remember that if you ever make the people of this city suffer for no reason, this sword will take both your heads off. Then, if anyone from this city ever tries to revolt against Lord Ainz, take their head off. Even if they're a child. I'm looking forward to it, to seeing these people rebelling, that is. I can't wait to see you writhe in agony as you kill them. Well, we'll be off now. Come along later." Ainz Ooal Gown's party leisurely moved on. Once the unusually long procession had passed and the group wasn't visible anymore, people poured out of their houses. Had there really been so many to begin with? There was such a surprisingly large crowd, it was enough to make anyone watching wonder. Many were praising Mammon. Mammon was awkwardly gesturing with both hands to calm them down when he heard a dry smack. He turned to look and saw the mother had slapped her son. "Why would you do that?" She slapped him again. Both mother and child were crying. But she kept slapping him. Mammon grabbed her hand. "Maybe we could call that enough?" I'd like to ask him something. Sir Mammon, I'm so sorry my son made trouble for you. Don't worry about it. More importantly, excuse me. Alright, you, don't cry. I want to talk to you. Mammon soothed the boy as best he could and asked him why he did what he did. Everyone must have thought all the boys wanted to avenge their fathers, but this one said a strange man egged him on, so he thought throwing the stone was the right thing to do. I see. Ma'am, you shouldn't scold him anymore. He was probably under the influence of a spell. I'm guessing it's a theocracy plot to drive Ainz Ooal Gown and me to go against each other. But, why would the theocracy do that? Don't you think it must be Ainz Ooal Gown's plot? To force you to become his henchman? It was the owner of a shop that opened a few years back who spoke, and Mammon nodded sincerely. I suppose that's another possibility. But that works in our favor if it's true. I'll be standing by near him, watching how he operates. If he seems like he's going to do anything that will harm all of you, I'll slice his head off right away. But in return, please don't rebel against him. Why not? With you on our side, please don't finish that sentence. They're already waiting for it. If you start a rebellion, they'll order me to kill you all, for their own amusement. Mammon spread his arms, facing the people in the street, and stated with confidence, I can't break that promise I made just now. That's why, as long as they aren't being unreasonable, I want you to accept what they say. If you think anything they ask is unreasonable, please tell me. Realizing that to Mammon, they were all hostages, the people's expressions turned sorrowful. But Mammon gave them a gentle laugh. Please don't worry too much. Besides, maybe he'll actually be a decent ruler. Let's see how things go. And if the theocracy has been active, there might be someone trying to incite you to rebel. Please be wary. There was no way that sat well with any of them. But no one offered any opposing opinions. Ainz Ooal Gown was an undead. None of them could trust a dangerous being who hated life. But there wasn't a single person who didn't believe in Mammon. And Mammon had just given up on his own objective for their sake. It was only natural that they would want to repay his kindness. The people all agreed with what Mammon said, promising they would tell the other people they knew before scattering into the city. As a result, the rule of Irantal changed over more bloodlessly, more peacefully, than the neighboring countries could ever have imagined. End of the 9th volume.